Hello, my name is Bonnie. Welcome to Only One Again. Today I'm going to be talking to you about a true crime story. This is all about the Lululemon murder. And this is a really brutal murder that took place in March of 2011 in a town called Bethesda, Maryland. In case you are unfamiliar with Lululemon brand, it's basically a store that sells overpriced yoga clothes, workout gear, mostly really expensive leggings, hoodies, things like that. And that is where this really awful murder took place. March the 12th of 2011. In the morning at around 8 a.m., just before 8 a.m., the store manager went to go and open the Lululemon store like she normally did. And that's when she noticed that the door was unlocked, which was completely, obviously not normal and not good. And when she walked in, she realized that some of the clothing was knocked off onto the ground and some things were on the floor and it was messed up looking. So she immediately left and called the police. So she went back into the store with another person who was there, and the two of them went in further into the store to see what was going on, to see if they could figure out what had happened. And they noticed that all the cash register tills were open and there was, money was gone. So it obviously had been a robbery. And that is when they went further into the store and they saw a woman, a dead body, laying face down in a pool of blood. And they let the police know that this is what they had found. And obviously it was like a really disturbing scene. In this room, along with the dead body and tons of blood, they saw glass that was smashed. They saw, things everywhere, bloody footprints, blood spatter up the walls. It was really gruesome scene. And then they also heard in a separate back room, in the employee bathroom, they saw another woman. This woman was laying on her back with her hands above her head. Her wrists were zip tied, her ankles were zip tied, and she looked like there was blood all over as well. But they noticed that this woman was still breathing. She was not dead. So the ambulance got there and they obviously took her straight to the hospital, hoping that they would, be able to save her life. These two women, one who was clearly deceased and one who was still alive, they were both the employees who had closed the night before. The two women were Jayna Murray, that was the woman who was deceased, and Brittany Norwood, that was the woman who was still alive and in the hospital. Jayna had received so many wounds. She was beaten to a pulp, completely unrecognizable. She ended up, the autopsy showed later that she had 331 separate wounds to her body, most of the wounds to her neck, face, and head. It was really disturbing what had happened to her. On top of her body, they actually found a toolbox that was with all, and a tool scattered around the room that were all used as the weapons to murder her. Tools including wrenches, a hammer, a box cutter. I mean, you name it. There were almost half a dozen different tools used to brutally attack her. And there were also footprints all over the place. There were more than one pair of footprints, but one clear footprints that were all over the scene were a men's pair of running shoes that were size 14. So really big running shoes that had been stepping all over the scene. The trail of blood also went to the back room, exit door. And there were the set of the store keys it was one of those back exit doors that had the push bar, and an alarm would sound unless you had keys to specifically turn that feature off, which there was. So obviously no blood was out there. There was no trail of blood to show that anybody had left that way, but it looked like at some point one of the women or both of them had tried to escape out that exit door. Jayna's autopsy showed such extensive wounds. It's so disturbing. Like I said, she had at least 331 stab wounds. She had rope marks around her neck. She had skull fractures. Her skull was basically caved in. It showed also that she was unfortunately alive up until the very last blow, which was what ultimately killed her, was a stab wound to the back of her neck that had severed her spinal column. Brittany was taken to the hospital, and even though there was blood all over and it was hard to tell immediately what wounds and injuries she did have, it turns out that she only had a few superficial wounds to her. She had her a gash to her forehead that they had to stitch up, and she also had a cut mark on her hand. She had some other wounds that were very kind of light, like cuts with a razor or something, to her stomach and abdomen area. But she also had her leggings cut open, and she told the police that she had been sexually assaulted by the attackers. Jayna Murray was 30 years old at the time of her death. She grew up mostly in Texas, and she was described as a really hard worker, a happy and really energetic, enthusiastic person, and she was really outgoing. She had studied business and communications, and she was planning on getting married to her longtime boyfriend. The other victim, Brittany Norwood, was 28 years old, and she was born in Seattle, Washington, in a really big family. She was one of 9 kids, and she had a big, happy, supportive, close family. She was described as a really high achiever, and she was really involved in sports, specifically soccer. She went and played soccer for her university team for a while, but it was said that when she was a part of the soccer team, there were some issues that had come up because once she joined the soccer team, people realized that there were some things being stolen from the locker room. And when they further looked into it, they realized that it was right when Brittany had joined the team. And so when they confronted her, she actually confessed. Also, it came to light that Brittany also had different people in her past who also had accused her of stealing in adulthood as well, not just when she was a teenager, but she was actually fired from another Lululemon location before joining this one in Bethesda, and she had been accused of stealing some merchandise at that store. But she was planning on becoming a personal trainer and one day even owning her own gym. So that's what she was working towards, and she even had a job interview set up shortly after, like it was going to be shortly after this attack had happened. She was going to be interviewed for a personal trainer job. So she had big plans for herself as well. And so police really wanted to speak with Brittany, and because they were able to sort of help her out in the hospital fairly quickly because her wounds weren't so bad, police did question her. And the story that she told them was that she and Jayna had closed up the store the night before, and they locked up, and Jayna got into her car to return home, and Brittany set off walking towards the subway station to return home. But when she was almost at the station, she realized that she had forgotten her Metro card back in the store. So she didn't have keys to the store, only Jayna did. So she called around to a bunch of different employees that she knew their phone number, asking for Jayna's phone number. And eventually she got a hold of Jayna and told her the story and said, would you mind returning to the store? I need my Metro card in order to get back home. And Jayna did return back. She didn't mind, also because she had forgotten her own laptop in the store. So Jayna returned shortly after to the store, and she parked her car right outside, like she illegally parked because she knew she was just going to go right in and out. She parked right in front of the store, and she unlocked the store, turned off the alarm, and the two of them went back in. And that's when Jayna got her laptop, and Brittany was looking around for her Metro card. She was having trouble finding it. And then two of them turned around, and they saw these 2 masked intruders who basically ambushed them. They had obviously come in through the unlocked door and attacked the 2 women. Brittany says that they were both wearing masks. They were dressed all in black. One was a little taller, one was a little shorter. And one of them took Brittany and one of them took Jayna. The one who took Jayna bashed her in the head and dragged her by the hair to the back room. And Brittany said she didn't really see her much after that. Brittany says that she was dragged to the back area where the cash registers were, and she was forced to open up all the tills, and gave them all the money. She said that the masked men like demanded that she put the money into their backpacks, and after she did that, they took her into a separate area of the back rooms, and they zip tied her wrists, they zip tied her ankles, and they attacked her. She said that this guy hit her and tortured her. He kept threatening to hurt her, and then he cut open her leggings and he assaulted her, sexually assaulted her. She said during this time, she could hear Jayna screaming from the other room. At some point, she said that the men picked her up and threw her onto Jayna's body, dead body, covered in blood. Then the men said they were going to spare her life, and they threw her into the employee bathroom, and that's where she lay until she was found the next morning. She also said to the police that she had this horrible survivor's guilt. She felt so guilty for being responsible in terms of asking Jayna to return to the store, and that she had survived. She just felt really guilty for that. She also said during the police interview that she said, "How's Jayna doing?" Like she didn't know what ultimately had happened to Jayna. So obviously police wanted to check all of this right away. So they checked for security footage, and they were able to find security footage, but not from the Lululemon store. They didn't have any CCTV set up, but the Apple store, which was right next door, did have security footage from their store. So they could see some things, but they couldn't see directly what had happened. One thing that they saw was two men matching the description that Brittany had said, two men all wearing all black around the time of the attack, that they were walking outside, passing by the stores. So right away, police put this out to the public. They talked about the attacks, and they said, we're looking for these two people who are possibly connected with this brutal attack. They also questioned the Apple store staff to see if there was any eyewitnesses or anybody who could hear anything or saw anything during this attack. And they did. They found some employees who had been there present during the attack next door in the Apple store. And this one employee said she actually heard screaming and shouting that had happened at around 10 o'clock the night before. And she said that she could hear two women, that they were shouting. She said it sounded like there was banging happening. And she was so concerned that she approached one of the Apple store security guards and told them what she heard. And then that security guard went over closer to the wall to see what he could hear. And yes, he agreed that he could hear, some kind of kerfuffle, some kind of thing happening. And so he banged on the wall. That's it. No one went to check to see if anybody was okay. Nobody called the police. They just heard some drama going on, didn't want to get involved, and that was it, which is ridiculous. So they could tell that it happened shortly after 10:05, closer to 10:15. And the attack, judging from all the weapons used, judging from all the wounds that happened and everything else, they thought it would have taken at least 20 minutes of this attack happening. Police were wondering where Jayna's car was because Brittany's story said that Jayna had parked it right outside the front of the store. But when the store manager came the next morning, the car was no longer there. So they thought maybe the attackers had stolen the car. So the police were looking around, and they actually found Jayna's car 2 to 3 blocks away, parked in a parking lot. So they took the car in for forensic testing to see what they could find inside the car that could help them solve this murder mystery. Then they went about continuing to look for these two men that they had seen on the camera footage. And a detective that was kind of staking out the area a couple days later saw the two men walking along the street in the same location at around the same time. And he stopped them and questioned them and showed them the photos of these two men that they had caught on the CCTV footage from before. And the men said, yeah, that looks like that's us. And it turns out that they were just employees of a restaurant that worked a couple stores down from the Apple store and from Lululemon. And so they actually had no involvement whatsoever in the crime. So that lead kind of went nowhere. The public was also asked for any tips connected with this in the days after the crime. And several people thought that it could be this homeless man named Keith who was like a local in the area. He was known to be quite violent and aggressive, and he had not been at the local bar that he always hung out at the night of the crime. He wasn't there. So people thought that was pretty suspicious. And when they looked further into it, they found that Keith had been at the hospital covered in blood. And so they thought, oh, I wonder if this is to do with this crime, but it was to do with a completely different crime. He had gotten into a fight with a different homeless man, and it turns out that he was not involved either. So there were a lot of tips, but the leads didn't go anywhere. But when police were looking more into the crime scene and questioning Brittany further, they realized that a lot of things weren't adding up. One thing that was really strange was that the weapons used were all from within the store. These attackers hadn't brought anything of their own, or at least they hadn't used any of their own knives or guns or anything that they would have brought with them. So they used the tools from a toolbox from within the store. And they also used the zip ties that were from the store as well. Another thing that was really strange was that the police thought was weird was the brutality of this attack. For it just being a random stranger who was trying to rob the store, why did they attack Jayna so severely and for so long? This prolonged attack that would have taken much longer than necessary. But then Brittany had these very superficial wounds. It just wasn't adding up. Another strange things were these footprints, these shoe prints that were from these huge men's shoes, running shoes, that were all over the scene. It turns out that those shoes that they later found discarded near the store, these bloody shoes, it turns out were from the store. Even though this Lululemon store didn't actually sell these shoes, they had a couple of pairs of shoes for any customers who wanted to try on shoes with the clothing. So if a customer came in and they wanted to try on a pair of shoes with the leggings or whatever to see what it looked like or how it fit, they had this pair of shoes there for the customers to wear, and those were the shoes that were used. So it was strange. How would these attackers know? Like if they had put them on in order to cover up their own shoe prints. So they came in and they switched out their shoes. They put on these store shoes and then later discarded them. That's pretty lucky that how would they have known unless maybe they were, I don't know. It was strange. The shoe part was strange. Also, these shoe prints were the only ones on the scene besides Brittany's shoes. They could only see this other one pair of men's shoes. So where was the second attacker's shoe prints? There was so much blood. I told you that Jayna's attack was really brutal. There was so much blood. She was lying in a pool of her own blood, and there was just blood all over the scene. But there was only one pair of men's shoes. So that didn't really match up with Brittany's story either. So police quickly thought Brittany isn't telling the whole truth. Maybe she was in on it somehow. Maybe she knew the attackers or helped out or something like that. So police were looking more and more into Brittany's past to see if they could get a clue that way. And that's when they found out even more about her past of like lying and stealing. It turns out that she had a lot of petty thefts in her past, not just stealing from her soccer team locker room and things like that. She also had like scammed and stolen money from her friends. She had run out on a hair appointment. Like she went into a hair place and had her hair done worth hundreds of dollars of a product and service, whatever. And then she failed to pay that. She had lied about graduating from university to her family and friends. Turns out she was kicked out of college, possibly because of the theft that she had, that had happened. She also had restraining orders from her ex-boyfriend. Her ex-boyfriend was with a new girl, and so Brittany was like stalking them and harassing them, and she even broke into her ex-boyfriend's house and stole things, and there was a restraining order placed against her that she continued to violate. Like she kept going and like stalking him, and so she had this whole history of being shady and weird. It also turns out that recently Brittany was in trouble with the Lululemon store that she was working at where this crime took place, because people were suspecting that she was actually stealing from their store as well. So some of the managers and employees got together and had a meeting just a few days before this crime took place, saying that if anybody caught her stealing again, that she would have to be fired. So she was sort of put on notice. There was also a store policy where the employees would check each other's bags at the end of the shift so that they would keep each other honest or whatever. So they knew that they would show their bag to the other employee, they would check, make sure there was no stolen merchandise in there. I guess that was just the way they did it. And the night of the murder, Jayna checked Brittany's bag and found that she had indeed stolen a pair of leggings. I think she was just a kleptomaniac. I really don't think that this was something like she had to do out of necessity. Like she was just used to doing it. Maybe she got a kick out of stealing things. I don't know what her problem was. But so when they checked in the car, they found, for the forensic testing and everything, they found evidence of both women's blood in the car. They also found a hat with blood on the inside of the rim, right where Brittany's forehead gash would have been. So then police were thinking, okay, well, Brittany might have been involved in helping these attackers move Jayna's car for some reason. They were really suspicious. The other reason why they were suspicious is that even though Brittany said that she had been sexually assaulted, both women had been checked, and it turns out there was no rapes at all happening. So why would Brittany lie about that? Why were their leggings torn open like that? It was really strange. They also started now looking at the whole crime scene with this other viewpoint. Let's say that Brittany had done it all. And that's when they realized that the zip ties that had been used to tie up Brittany's wrists had teeth marks on them. In other words, she had been using her teeth to tighten up the zip ties on her wrists. The wounds that she had that were all kind of not too deep or whatever, they were self-inflicted. She'd used a razor or something to cut herself to make it look like she had been attacked. She had hit herself in the head with a forehead, and she had a gash here that was actually from a blade, which happens if there's like a lot of slippery blood. And sometimes that happens if you're doing all of these repeated stabbing. Also, the way that they had found her, when the police had gone in and found Brittany, she had been laying in the employee bathroom surrounded by all this blood smeared everywhere, which turns out to be Jayna's blood, not hers. And she was tied with her hands, but she had them above her head, and she was kind of like posed in this awkward position. Again, all of these little things started to add up, and police were really getting suspicious that Brittany was the one who was doing all of this. So Brittany actually later came into the police voluntarily and said, oh yeah, I just remembered something. Remember how I said I had no idea how the car moved? Well, I just remembered that the attackers asked me to move the car. She said the attackers made her find Jayna's car keys and told her to go move the car and park it in, blocks away. And then they told her that she had to come back. So she voluntarily returned to the store to continue the beating. That would never happen. It doesn't make any sense. So police obviously confronted her and said, all of these things don't make sense. Here's what's not adding up. And they asked her point blank, we know you did it. And she said, she got really defensive, and she said that she wanted to go home. So the police went back and they actually brought in her sister and her brother. And in front of them, they started going over a lot of the evidence again in front of Brittany to sort of say, we've got you, tell us what happened for real. And that's when her sister had to leave the room, and it was just her brother and her. And she let the two of them stay alone in the room for a few minutes to talk, obviously with the tape still rolling. And the brother said, just be honest, what happened? And Brittany said, she said, I don't want to talk about this here. So that's when the police were like, okay, she's in other words, she's admitting that she did something. So 1 week after the attack, Brittany Norwood was arrested for the murder of Jayna.
Case that has stunned many here in Maryland and even grabbed national headlines. Jayna Murray was laid to rest this weekend after being killed in the yoga store where she worked. Now, in a twist few saw coming, her co-worker has been charged with murder. ABC's John Hendren has more on the clues that finally tipped off investigators.
Police now say it was a pair of shoes that first tipped them off. The crime scene had 2 pairs of bloody footprints, but police believe one of them was faked by Brittany Norwood using a store pair to appear like a perpetrator's footprints. And when police found Norwood bound and gagged, they now say the position she was tied up in was suspicious, that with her hands tied above her head, she may have tied herself up.
As we began analyzing the forensic evidence and looked at the medical reports, it was not supporting what Ms. Norwood had told us.
All of this contradicts the story Norwood tried to tell police. According to her, after closing up this store for the night, she and Jayna Murray went back to pick up Norwood's wallet. 2 masked men followed them in, bound them, sexually assaulted them, and when Murray resisted, beat and stabbed her to death. But medical examiners found no evidence of sexual assault on either victim. According to police, Murray's car had been moved and had been spattered with Norwood's blood. And on the night of the killing, workers at this Apple store next door say they heard 2 women arguing.
As you go through a list of 14 or 16 or 18 things the victim told you, you can draw a line almost through every one of them.
There was one other thing. Norwood's wounds were superficial, Murray's were deep. It was a scene painted in blood. One experts say suggests intense rage.
That's a personal homicide. That's a close stabbing, blunt force trauma. She was angry, majorly angry.
So what was the motive? What would motivate somebody, a 28-year-old woman, to just murder her coworker out of the blue like this? And even though she never outright admitted it, what people have kind of come to the conclusion was that she was caught stealing and she didn't want to get in trouble. I mean, it sounds so petty. So she was caught stealing, so she would have lost her job. You would murder someone like over that? It doesn't add up. So obviously she's got issues. I mean, that's just such an over the top response. It doesn't make any sense to normal people listening to the story. But yeah, I think she just didn't want to be reported. They got into a conflict. But her defense lawyers, when she did go to trial, her defense attorney said, yes, she did it. I mean, it was so obvious. All the evidence pointed to her. They said, yes, she did it, but it wasn't premeditated, that it was sort of a heat of the moment argument and she just lost her temper and snapped or whatever. And even more evidence came forward during the trial, all pointing towards Brittany obviously doing this brutal attack and then trying to cover it up. It turns out that after she lured Jayna back to the store under the guise of, I forgot my Metro card. And then after she had this brutal attack, she then realized that she had to move the car because she didn't want it obvious that this car was just sitting illegally out. She didn't want it to be noticeable. The store manager actually lived across the street, so she was probably worried that Jayna's car would set off alarms. So she moved the car to a few blocks away, and it turns out she sat there for over an hour just thinking up what to do, how to cover this crime up. And that's when she went back to the crime scene and, made the scene look like with all the boots. She probably put on these shoes. She stomped around the store to make it look like some intruder had come in. She wiped the blood around to make it look like she was covered in blood as well. She did all these self-inflicted wounds. She tied herself up with the zip ties, posed herself, and waited to be discovered the next morning. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before finding her guilty, and the judge sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole. Since then, she has asked for a retrial. They tried to appeal, saying that she wasn't read her Miranda rights correctly when she was under all of these questioning by the police. But that's been denied, and she's just going to spend the rest of her life in prison for the brutal murder of this 30-year-old girl for no reason, for a pair of leggings.
A jury convicted her of first-degree murder in 2011 and sentenced her to life without parole. Now Norwood wants a new trial.
It's so clear-cut that she was the one who did this that there's no way that she should deserve a retrial.
That is a story of the Lululemon murder. Let me know in the comments if you've heard of this story before or what your thoughts are. If you're interested in true crime stories like I am, or you like to just talk about other random, interesting things, please come back and join me again on my YouTube channel, Only One Again. Please subscribe if you would like to hear more stories. And if you have a suggestion of a story that you'd like me to cover, please let me know in the comments.